It begins with the muffled sound of students shifting in plastic chairs. A fluorescent light hums above. In the frame, a girl's small frame, her hands clutching a paper that shakes like a leaf in the wind. Her voice catches in her throat as she tries to speak. She stammers. Laughter ripples, not cruel at first, but nervous. The kind of laughter teenagers use when they don't know what else to do. Then, cutting through that fragile air, the teacher's voice, sharp, dripping with sarcasm. Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming, you'd remember how to speak. The room freezes. Some students gasp. Some hide smiles behind their hands. The girl's face turns crimson. She lowers her paper, swallowing hard, as though the floor might open and swallow her whole. And for a long second, the sound is silence. But the silence has witnesses. From the back of the room, a phone camera lingers on the teacher's curled lip, the girl's trembling shoulders. A whisper, "I'm posting this tonight." Fade to black. Los Angeles, a city that sells itself as a dream. Sunlight bouncing off glass towers, murals sprawling across crumbling walls, and teenagers trudging into classrooms carrying away to futures they're barely old enough to imagine. Inside Roosevelt High, the air is no different from any other American high school. Lockers slam, sneakers squeak, backpacks groan with unfinished homework. But inside one second-floor classroom, a story is unraveling that no one expects to leave those four walls. The girl, her name is Marisol, 16, daughter of a bus driver and a home aide. She loves sketching in the margins of her notebook, drawing little comic strips where the heroes always win. But here, in this classroom, she doesn't feel like a hero. She feels invisible. Invisible until she isn't. And the teacher? Mrs. Hardwick, 49. Rumors say she was once the kind of teacher who made kids tougher. But ask quietly, and you'll hear another truth. She was mean, ruthless, a woman who mistook cruelty for control. That day was supposed to be simple, student presentations. But when Marisol stood at the front, her voice trembling, Mrs. Hardwick decided it was time to make an example. "Speak up, girl," or "Don't waste our time." The words hung in the air like smoke. And though Marisol would later say she wanted to vanish, what happened next ensured she never could, because someone had pressed a record. That night, the halls of Roosevelt High were quiet, but online, a storm brewed. A video, no longer than 30 seconds, appeared on a student's page. The caption read, "She really said this to her flushed-faced, pouting-faced." Within minutes, comments piled in. "This is disgusting." "Poor girl, crying-faced. Who talks to a kid like that?" And then shares. Shares that leapt from school to city, city to state, until the views climbed into the thousands. By morning, the clip wasn't just a whisper. It was a roar. And Marisol, the girl who couldn't get through a sentence without stuttering, she had become the center of a story she never asked to star in. The next morning, Mrs. Hardwick walked into class, her heels clicking confidently on the linoleum floor. She thought it was just another day, but the stares told her otherwise. Not the usual mix of teenage boredom and exhaustion. No, these eyes carried something sharper. Some looked at her with thinly veiled disgust. Others avoided her gaze completely. A few smirked, the way kids do when they know a secret you don't. Mrs. Hardwick set her purse down, smoothed her blazer, and cleared her throat. "Take your seats," she snapped. But the command didn't land the same way. There was a hesitation in the air. Chairs scraped reluctantly. Backpacks shuffled slower than usual. And somewhere in the back, muffled laughter. Not at her joke, not at a classmate, but at her. She didn't know yet. But Marisol did. Marisol had barely slept. Her phone buzzed all night. Messages, tags, strangers leaving comments that made her stomach twist. At first, she thought maybe this was worse. That being invisible was better than being known for this. But when she opened one message from a girl in another state, it said simply, "This happened to me too. Thank you for showing it." For the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. Still, walking through the school doors that morning felt like walking through fire. Whispers followed her down the hallway. Some kids offered awkward smiles. Others gave sympathetic nods. A few bullies hissed, as I spit it out, mocking her stutter. But she kept walking, head low, backpack straps gripped tight in her fists. By third period, the school's walls had already failed to contain the storm. Students huddled in corners, phones glowing, replaying the clip. They mimicked the teacher's sharp tone. Some laughed, others shook their heads. The video had become a mirror, forcing every student to remember the times they too had been cut down, dismissed, or humiliated by someone who was supposed to guide them. One boy muttered under his breath, "She did that to me last year, told me I'd never make it to college." His friends nodded solemnly. Stories began spilling like cracks in a dam. For years, Mrs. Hardwick's cruelty had been chalked up to tough love. But now, those words rang hollow. And once the truth found a stage, it couldn't be shoved back into the shadows. That afternoon, the school's principal called Mrs. Hardwick into his office. The blinds were drawn, the air stiff. He gestured toward a laptop on his desk. The paused video glowed on the screen. Her face twisted as she leaned closer. "This," she scoffed, "this is what's causing a fuss? A little discipline." The principal shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just this. It's the reaction. Parents are calling. News outlets have already reached out." Mrs. Hardwick waved a hand. "Teenagers are dramatic. This will pass." But even as she said it, her phone buzzed. A text from her sister. "You're trending. Not in a good way." At home, Marisol sat at the kitchen table while her mother stirred a pot of beans on the stove. The room smelled of garlic and onions, the kind of comfort that usually wrapped Marisol in safety. But tonight, comfort felt far away. Her mother finally broke the silence. "Mija, are you sure about all this? Being seen?" Marisol swallowed. Her voice was small. "I didn't choose it. But maybe it's not just about me." Her mother turned, eyes wet. She pulled Marisol into a hug, the kind that press away fear for a few seconds. Then we stand together. Online, the story was no longer confined to Roosevelt High. Local activists retweeted the clip, framing it as proof of systemic abuse of power in schools. When authority humiliates instead of teaches, children pay the price. One caption read, hashtags multiplied. Hashtag stand with Marisol. Hashtag end classroom bullying. Hashtag power abused. Former students of Roosevelt High began emerging like ghosts from the past. On TikTok, one girl recounted, tears in her eyes. "She told me my English was broken and I'd never succeed. I believed her for years." Another posted, "She used to rip up my homework in front of everyone. Said it was trash. I never forgot." The stories stacked up, each one adding weight to a narrative that had been buried in silence for too long. Mrs. Hardwick tried to maintain her facade. In the teacher's lounge, she rolled her eyes at colleagues. "They're soft. That's the problem. Kids these days can't handle a little correction." But not everyone nodded in agreement. Some teachers shifted uncomfortably. Others sipped their coffee in silence because they, too, had seen her methods. They just never thought they'd see them exposed to the world. By Friday, the school was a powder keg. Protest signs began appearing near the entrance. "Respect students. Stop the abuse. We believe her." Parents gathered with folded arms and grim expressions. Reporters set up cameras at the curb, their vans lining the street. And inside, Mrs. Hardwick faced a room full of students who no longer feared her. When she barked, "Eyes up here," the eyes stayed on their phones. When she snapped, "No talking," the whispers grew louder. Authority had slipped through her fingers, and she didn't even realize it was gone. But Marisol realized something else. The story wasn't slowing down. It was growing, mutating, turning into something larger than her, larger than one classroom. She felt both terrified and strangely powerful, like she was holding a candle in a storm, and watching it light torches she never meant to ignite. That weekend, local news stations ran the clip during prime time. The anchor's voice was solemn. "A Los Angeles teacher is under fire tonight after a video surfaced, showing her mocking a student with a speech disorder." The school district has yet to release an official statement, but outrage is spreading. Marisol watched the broadcast with her father, who sat silently in his work boots, arms crossed. At the end, he muttered, They think they can break us, but they won't. Marisol's hands trembled in her lap, but her eyes stayed fixed on the screen. She had been humiliated in front of 30 classmates. Now millions were watching, and the balance of power was shifting. Late Sunday night, as Marisol tried to sleep, her phone lit up again. This time, it wasn't just strangers. It was an email from a local journalist. The subject line read, "We need to talk. Others are coming forward." She sat up in bed, the glow of the screen painting her face in pale blue light. Her stomach tightened. The journalist's words were brief but urgent. "You're not alone. We're speaking with former students who experienced similar treatment. If you're ready, your voice could change everything." Marisol's finger hovered over the reply button. She wasn't sure she wanted to be more than just a blurry face in a viral clip. She wasn't sure she wanted her name tied to something so explosive. But then, in the quiet of her room, she remembered the message from that stranger. "This happened to me too. Thank you for showing it." With a shaky breath, she whispered into the dark, "Okay," and she typed one word back. Yes. By Monday morning, the storm had outgrown Roosevelt High. The clip had jumped from local feeds to national talk shows. Anchors debated it. Radio hosts dissected it. The narrative wasn't just about one cruel teacher anymore. It was about power, humiliation, and how often students suffered in silence. Reporters swarmed the school gates. Microphones shoved forward, cameras flashed, and students found themselves walking through a gauntlet of questions. Did you see what happened? Has she done this before? Do you think the teacher should be fired? Some shrugged nervously. Others whispered into the microphones, their faces blurred on screen later that night. Yeah, she's always been like that. This wasn't new. Inside her classroom, Mrs. Hardwick's walls were crumbling. She tried to resume business as usual, handing out worksheets and barking corrections. But every move she made was under surveillance, not just from hidden phones, but from eyes sharpened by newfound boldness. Students who once cowered now stared back, unflinching. The authority she wielded like a weapon was dulling before her eyes. At lunch, teachers gathered in hushed circles. Some murmured sympathy, not for her, but for the kids. Others looked pale, remembering the times they'd turned a blind eye, convincing themselves her cruelty was just her style. Now, with every new news segment, that silence looked more like complicity. That week, former students began stepping into the light. One young woman, now in college, sat across from a reporter with trembling hands. She used to mock my accent, said I sounded uneducated. I stopped speaking in class for the rest of high school. I almost didn't go to college because of her. Another, a young man working construction, recalled, "She called me stupid, in front of everybody. I still hear in my head sometimes when I mess up, like I'm 16 again." Their testimony spilled into social media, fueling hashtags, building a damning archive of pain. Each story layered over the last, until Mrs. Hardwick wasn't just a single villain in a viral clip. She was a symbol of every authority figure who had hidden cruelty behind a mask of discipline. Marisol watched it unfold with a mixture of awe and dread. Her name, once unknown outside a small circle of classmates, was now whispered by strangers across the country. Some called her brave. Others, predictably cruel, left venom in the comments. Kids these days are too sensitive. She probably deserved it. But the tide of support was louder. One afternoon, walking to her locker, Marisol found a note folded carefully between the slats. It read, "You made me feel less alone. Thank you." She clutched it like armor. The school board could no longer pretend this was a passing controversy. A formal meeting was scheduled. Parents packed the auditorium, their voices sharp with outrage. Microphones caught words like abuse, trauma, accountability. When Mrs. Hardwick walked in, her face tight with indignation, the air turned electric. She took her seat at the long table, flanked by administrators who avoided her eyes. The board chair cleared his throat. "We're here to address recent allegations." But even as he spoke, reporters scribbled furiously, cameras rolling. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a trial in the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, the journalist who had emailed Marisol sat in her family's living room. recorder on the table. The reporter's voice was calm, careful. "You don't have to share more than you're comfortable with," she said. Marisol hesitated, fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. But when she began to speak, halting at first, her stutter punctuating her words, something shifted. She wasn't just recounting humiliation. She was reclaiming it. She described the sting of laughter, the crushing silence, the way her teacher's words had made her feel small enough to disappear. And the journalist listened, not mocking, not rushing, just listened. When they finished, Marisol's mother placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You did good, Mija." For the first time, Marisol believed her. The fallout spread beyond the school walls. Talk shows debated whether teachers had too much unchecked power. Psychologists weighed in on the long-term scars of humiliation. Hashtags trended daily. And across the country, students began sharing their own hidden wounds. The story had cracked something open, something raw, something that could no longer be pushed back into silence. For Mrs. Hardwick, the pressure was suffocating. She lashed out in interviews, insisting, "This is a witch hunt. Kids are exaggerating. I've dedicated my life to teaching." But her voice, once commanding, now sounded desperate. Clips of her defensive rants were spliced into montages alongside student testimonies, painting her as cold, detached, unrepentant. Her classroom, once a throne, had become a cage. Students no longer feared her. They pitted her, or worse, mocked her. Every time she opened her mouth, she wondered if a phone was capturing her downfall in real time. Then came the turning point. One investigative report unearthed years of complaints buried in district files. Parents had written letters. Students had begged for transfers. Some administrators had flagged her behavior quietly. But nothing had been done. Now, those ignored complaints resurfaced like ghosts with teeth. The headlines read, "Pattern of abuse. Teachers' misconduct spans decades." It wasn't just Marisol anymore. There were dozens, maybe hundreds. As the sun set over Los Angeles, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Marisol sat by her bedroom window. The city buzzed outside, cars honking, sirens wailing, life carrying on as if nothing had changed. But inside, everything felt different. She wasn't invisible anymore. But visibility came with weight, with danger, with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. But this one wasn't from a stranger. It was from someone claiming to be a former teacher at Roosevelt High. The message read, "You don't know half of what she's done. Call me." Marisol stared at the screen, her pulse pounding. If what this person said was true, the story wasn't just about humiliation in a classroom. It was about something deeper, darker, and long hidden. And once again, the floor beneath her seemed to crack open, pulling her into a story far bigger than herself. She called from the family car, parked under a street lamp that buzzed with moths. The voice on the other end was careful, older, worn down to the wire. "I can't give you my name," the woman said, "but I taught at Roosevelt. I left 6 years ago." A pause, breath hitching. "I wrote complaints, not just about sarcasm, about targeting, about how she singled out kids who struggled, English learners, kids with IEPs, kids who stuttered. She called it weeding out the weak." The moth smacked the glass. Marisol's fingers dug into the steering wheel. "Did anyone listen? They filed my reports, then told me to focus on my own classroom," the woman said. "I still have copies. Emails. Meeting notes. You're not the first. You're the first they couldn't bury." The call ended with a number and a promise. She'd drop a manila envelope at a hair salon on Soto Street, tucked behind a stack of magazines. First chair by the window. Leaving it at school would be too obvious. Marisol sat there a little longer, the car's interior smelling like sun-baked seat vinyl and laundry detergent. Downtown lights flickered at the edge of the windshield. The city moved on, honking and humming, while somewhere a stranger was risking her job to pass along the truth. By morning, the envelope was in the journalist's hands. On the cover, a post-it with a single sentence, "Don't let them call this a one-off." Inside lay copies of memos, emails with subject lines like classroom tone concerns and parent escalation advise. There were notes from a counselor, polite to the point of bloodlessness. Student requests transfer due to persistent embarrassment during class participation. There were timestamps, dates, administrator CC, a breadcrumb trail, and district letterhead. The journalist's eyes widened, then sharpened. "We'll corroborate," she said. "If this holds, it changes everything." The auditorium smelled like lemon cleaner and fear. Folding chairs lined up in row after row. The seat numbers taped in a hurry. Camera tripods marched along the aisle like a forest of black metal. The school board sat at a long table, water bottles and nameplates glinting beneath the stage lights. Behind them, a banner read Roosevelt Unified, excellence for all. Tonight, the slogan felt like a dare. Parents packed the room, voices low but hot. Students clustered in the back, holding poster board signs whose marker ink hadn't fully dried. Respect students. Heal the harm. We believe her. A boy in a varsity jacket kept his eyes on the exit, breathing through his mouth like he was trying not to be sick. Mrs. Hardwick entered with a union rep and a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Pearls at her throat. Navy blazer. Pressed sharp. She sat with posture taught in finishing schools and old churches. Shoulders back, chin up, look like you belong. Her eyes flicked across the room like a scanner, tallying who was with her and who wasn't. The numbers weren't on her side. The board chair tapped the microphone. Feedback squealed. "We're here in response to the video circulated widely this week." He began, voice flat as a ledger. "We asked for orders. We asked for respect." Respect. The word pinballed around the auditorium and thudded into history. One by one, they spoke. A mother whose son, now 22, still couldn't stand at a podium without his hands shaking. A soft-spoken girl with braces who clenched a photo of herself at age 12, eyes red from crying. A tall kid, track star, rumor had it, who murmured into the mic, "She called me lazy every day. I ran extra sprints to prove her wrong. It never mattered. Nothing mattered." Mrs. Hardwick kept her head cocked at a thoughtful angle that said, "This is all very interesting." When it was her turn, she leaned forward, palms flat. "My methods are direct," she said. "I don't apologize for holding high standards. Teenagers interpret accountability as cruelty. We cannot throw educators to the wolves every time a student feels uncomfortable. The clip shows a moment, not a career." The room stiffened. The union rep patted her forearm under the table. A small signal. Rein it in. An older board member cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hardwick, are you aware of prior complaints?" "I received feedback," she said, voice smooth as the pearls. "Like any professional, most of it comes from parents who believe their children are exceptional when, in fact, they need structure." A murmur swelled like a wave and broke against the stage. Then came the journalist, press badge around her neck, hair pulled back, eyes steady. "With permission," she said, "I'd like to enter into the record several documents acquired through a public records request." A screen flickered on. An email appeared, projected 20 feet wide. The room leaned forward. From Assistant Principal Elena C. Subject: Classroom Climate Concerns. Hardwick. Date: March 14, 20. Body: We've received multiple reports of demeaning commentary during English 2. Students report reluctance to participate due to fear of ridicule. Advising observation. Please document. Avoid escalation unless pattern is indisputable. Another slide. Another email. Parents are persistent. Label as high conflict to prevent meeting redundancy. Then a memo from Human Resources, 6 years old, referencing a site-based intervention plan. The plan's language was bureaucratic and aseptic. What it asked was cold. Keep it quiet, keep it contained, keep it off the books as much as possible. The board chair's jaw tightened. In the second row, a counselor covered her mouth with her hand. A man at the aisle mic, in a crisp suit with a pen that read alumni, cleared his throat. His voice vibrated like he had swallowed a motor. "She told me I spoke like a criminal," he said. "Said my words would get me in trouble more than they'd get me into college. I got into college anyway." He lifted a certificate. Edges crinkled from living in his wallet. I'm a lawyer now, and I'm here to say my words matter. The auditorium snapped into applause. It wasn't polite. It was thundering. Mrs. Hardwick's smile didn't budge, but her left hand pinched the inside of her right elbow under the table, nails pressing crescents into flesh. At break. In the dim hallway smelling faintly of popcorn and dust, the ex-teacher stood in the shadow near the water fountain, a baseball cap pulled low. The journalist slid next to her, without looking, like they were strangers waiting for a bus. You kept everything, the journalist whispered. I kept what might matter, the ex-teacher said. I thought I would use it when I made tenure, or when I left, or when someone finally listened. I didn't think it would take a girl with a phone to make anyone care. A door opened. Light spilled across scuffed linoleum. They stepped apart, swallowed by the flow of parents crowding back to their seats. Back inside, a guidance counselor asked to speak, voice quivering, binder bristling with color-coded tabs. She described students who had stopped signing up for AP English out of fear. She pointed to numbers. In classes taught by Mrs. Hardwick, participation grades dipped harder for English learners. In her sections, more drop forms. We called it rigor, she said, eyes shining. But it wasn't. It was harmful. The union rep rose, finally. We urged the board to remember due process. A single video, the noise of social media. None of this substitutes for a fair investigation. The board chair nodded. Agreed. But we do not have a single video. We have a pattern. On the screen, a final document bloomed. A parent complained from another school entirely, dated a decade earlier, referencing a teacher with a different last name. Same credential number. A scrape of chair legs. Mrs. Hardwick went very still. The hearing stretched into the night. The auditorium's air cooled. Jackets pulled tighter. The fluorescent tubes above the stage hummed like a far-off power line. When the board at last returned from closed session, their faces carried the pallor of people who had seen enough and would now pretend they hadn't been able to see it sooner. The chair read the motion. Effective immediately, Ms. Hardwick is placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of a formal investigation. The district will refer this matter to the State Credentialing Commission for review. A hush, then a fragile cheer. Small at first, as if the room were afraid to believe the words out loud. Then bigger. It rolled over the rows, over the cameras and microphones, and the banner promising excellence, all the way to the doors where students stood shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped. Marisol exhaled, a breath she didn't know she'd been holding since the first laugh in that classroom. She pressed her fingertips together in a steeple and felt the tremor track through her arms, out her shoulders and away. Beside her, the varsity jacket boy cried into his sleeve. No one pretended not to notice. No one told him to toughen up. Outside, night had washed the parking lot the color of bruise. Reporters flooded toward the steps. Statements were demanded, refused, offered. A news went idle like a giant blue whale. Its dish pointed at the moon. A cluster of students gathered around Marisol. Someone handed her a marker. Someone else lifted a signboard. She hadn't planned to say anything. She didn't like microphones. She hated the way speakers echoed back at her, turning every stutter into a drum. But the journalist caught her eye and gave the smallest nod. Not do it, but you don't have to if you don't want to. Marisol took the marker. In block letters, she wrote 2 words. We matter. The crowd around her breathed out like a single body. A microphone appeared, floating on the end of an arm. What do you want to say to other students watching this? A reporter asked. Marisol's tongue felt thick. She could feel the old panic rising, the one that told her voice was a trespass. She swallowed. The wind lifted her hair and set it down again. I want to say, she began, then paused. The stutter came, a hitch you could almost see. The muscles under her jaw doing the heavy lift of moving sound into shape. I want to say that even if your voice shakes, it still counts. The sentence landed clean. The crowd answered with a long, low sound of something like relief. 2 days later, a knock sounded at the family apartment just after dinner. A courier in a neon vest held out a padded envelope. No return address. Inside, an HR transfer agreement from a district 2 counties away. The letterhead was different, the boilerplate impersonal, but the clause at the bottom was a live wire. The unusual line stating that upon transfer, the recipient personnel file will be consolidated, with prior performance memos waived from inclusion in the forward-facing record. Someone had inked a tiny star next to it, then written, "Look who signed." The signature scrawled across the bottom belonged to Roosevelt Unified's current assistant superintendent. The journalist held the paper carefully, like it might burn through her hands. "They knew," she said. "They moved her. They cleaned the trail." She flipped the page. A second document. A letter from a parent in that distant district, never answered, printed and kept. A plea about a child who had stopped speaking in class. The journalist's voice lowered. "This isn't just a teacher," she said. "It's a system that thought silence was cheaper than truth." The State Credentialing Commission sent a curt email. They were opening a formal review. The language was procedural, bloodless as snow. But between the lines lived reality. Classroom observations pulled. Interviews scheduled. 5-year patterns mapped. Complaints cross-checked. The hard math of harm account like a ledger at the end of a bad fiscal year. Mrs. Hardwick went quiet. No more interviews. No more statements. The last sighting was a neighbor's phone video of her taking out the trash at dusk, looking both ways like the street might accuse her. The school adjusted to the absence in ways big and small. The silence in her classroom was different now. Not the fearful kind, but the thoughtful one that fills a room when kids realize they can take a second to find the right words. Posters went up about kindness, about dignity, about speaking and listening. A sign appeared near the office window. "Report harm. Be heard." It wasn't a spell. It was a start. On a Friday, in the old auditorium with the velvet curtains that smelled like dust and church, the principal called an assembly. The stage lights were dim, softened to the warmth of a late afternoon. Students took their seats, knees knocking into the metal backs in front of them. The principal stepped to the mic, cleared his throat, and didn't read from a script. "We failed some of you," he said, voice catching. "We won't again." He nodded at the wings. A student in a denim jacket emerged, clutching a notebook Marisol. She didn't wear pearls or a pressed blazer, or armor made of tone. She wore the quiet courage of someone who knows their voice is sometimes a tightrope and is willing to step out anyway. She looked down at the paper, then up at the faces. 100, 200, 500 points of light reflecting stage glare. The microphone was taller than she was. She pulled it closer. "I wrote something," she said, and the first consonant scratched. The vowel dropped. The wave rose under her tongue. A handful of students shifted forward, not to catch her stumble, but to catch her when she flew. She began to read. The poem was spare. It didn't try to be clever. It didn't try to be more than a hand extended. It carried the taste of cafeteria oranges and the sound of sneakers on tile, and the ache of wanting to be small in a world that makes a game of stomping what's small. It didn't banish stuttering. It braided it into music. By the end, the room didn't clap. Not at first. They sat with it, sat in the truth of it. Then they stood, one by one, the way people stand after an anthem or eulogy or promise. Marisol lowered the paper. She did not bow. She did not hide. She stepped back from the mic, like stepping off a ledge into air that would hold. Backstage, the journalist wiped at her eye with the heel of her hand. The ex-teacher, hat pulled low, leaned against the wall, eyes shining. "Maybe this is how it ends," she murmured. The journalist shook her head. "I don't think we're at the end." Her phone buzzed. A new message. No subject line. No name. Just a photo of a file tab with a label printed in block capitals. Closed. Do not reopen. Beneath it, a scan page, blurred but legible enough. A note about a prior incident. Another district, another year, the same methods and the same pattern. This time including a list of administrators who'd signed off on the transfer with a stamp that said, "I am good standing." The journalist met Marisol's eyes across the table. She didn't raise the phone. She didn't have to. Outside, the wind kicked her, rattling the old auditorium doors. Inside, the lights hung, steady bright, unblinking, because some spotlights are punishment, and some are beginning, and somewhere beyond the school, finally children's pain. She highlighted, circled, and cross-referenced. The story was bigger than one food teacher. It was a system built to protect itself at any cost. By dawn, she knew this wasn't just a scam. It was an indictment of silence. Meanwhile, Marisol walked through the school courtyard with her backpack slung over. The morning air crisp with the smell of damp asphalt and blooming jack-o'-lantern trees. She noticed things she hadn't before. Way students now lingered outside her class. Way teachers softened their tone when correcting kids. Way silence in halls wasn't as sharp as fear. For the first time, she didn't feel like a background. She felt like the story itself. But stories were innovative. Her inbox overflowed with requests, interviews, podcasts, speaking engagements. She turned most down. She wasn't looking to be famous. She was still just a girl who liked sketching comic strips in the margins of her notebook. But she said yes to one invitation, a local youth summit on bullying. When she stepped on stage, her hands shook, she stuttered, and the room leaned forward, not mocking, not impatient, just waiting, like her pauses were part of the message. Her voice carried, imperfect, steady, whole. At Roosevelt, the investigation dug deeper. Administrators were placed on leave. Files were pulled from storage. Parents demanded open hearings. For the first time, questions weren't about what happened in that classroom, but why it was allowed to happen for so long. The board issued a public apology. The district promised reform, mandatory training, and an independent review. Words that sounded rehearsed, safe, meant to patch holes without rebuilding the roof. But this time, people weren't swallowing the script. They wanted accountability, not platitudes. For Mrs. Hardwick, life shrank. Her name was stripped from the teacher's lounge door. Her house, once a tidy bungalow with roses by the fence, became a fortress of drawn curtains. Neighbors whispered. Parents pulled their kids away on the sidewalk. Reporters camped outside, waiting for a statement that never came. One morning, a camera caught her walking to the mailbox in sweatpants, hair unbrushed, clutching a stack of official letters. The caption beneath the viral clip read, "Spotlight feels different, doesn't it?" She had made humiliation her weapon. Now it was her shadow. For Marisol, justice wasn't a headline. It was smaller moments stitched into her days. A boy who had once mimicked her stutter stopped in the hall, eyes down, and whispered, "I'm sorry." A teacher handed her a poem by Maya Angelou, its edges worn, saying, "I thought you'd like this." At night, she sketched a new comic strip, a girl with shaky hands standing before a giant monster labeled fear. She drew the girl opening her mouth and the monster shrinking in her final panel. The girl was still stuttering, but she was smiling. The journalist's expose dropped 3 weeks later. Front page, bold headline, "Protected by Silence, How a District Buried Abuse for Years." The article named names. It traced transfers. It revealed how complaints were shredded under the language of consolidation, how performance files were wiped clean with the stroke of a pen. The conclusion was clear. Mrs. Hardwick wasn't a rogue villain. She was the symptom of a culture that chose adults' reputations over children's voices. The outrage reignited. State officials opened inquiries. Parents across California demanded audits of their own districts. Talk shows debated whether accountability meant more than moving papers around. And somewhere in a quiet apartment, Marisol scrolled through the article, heart pounding. She whispered to herself, "It wasn't just me." The system had cracks. Light was pouring through, but justice isn't tidy. Some parents feared backlash. Some teachers bristled, muttering that kids had too much power now. Online trolls mocked Marisol's stutter, twisting her courage into cruelty. And through it all, the question hung heavy. Would this moment truly change anything? Or would the system bury itself again once the cameras turn away? One evening, after dinner, Marisol sat with her mother on the fire escape. The city sprawled before them, humming with cars, neon signs, sirens in the distance. Her mother sipped tea from a chipped mug. "You know," her mother said softly, "when I was your age, we kept our heads down. We thought speaking up would only make things worse. But you," she touched Marisol's hand, warm and firm, "you broke that cycle. Even if they don't change as fast as we want, you made them look. Marisol nodded. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a girl with shaky knees and a heart that beat too loud. But maybe that was what change really looked like. Messy, imperfect, unstoppable once it started rolling. Weeks later, in a district office 2 counties away, a clerk slid open a metal drawer. Dust rose in the slant of afternoon light. Inside lay folders stamped closed. She hesitated, then pulled one out. The label matched the blurred image the journalist had received. Do not reopen. She opened it anyway. The pages whispered secrets, complaints, warnings, memos. Different districts, different kids, same patterns, same signatures. She looked around the empty office, pulse quickening. Then she slipped the file into her bag. Because this story wasn't over. It wasn't just about a teacher. It wasn't just about a girl who stuttered. It was about power, silence, and how easily cruelty thrives when no one presses a record. The camera had rolled once, and the world saw. Now, the question burned hotter than ever. How many other classrooms still hide their monsters in plain sight? Was this justice for Marisol, or just the first crack in a much larger wall waiting to come down?
Like, comment, share, and subscribe for more Echoed Crime content. Thank you.